see some of the details of the life history of Nguyen CHÍ THIệN in major media like the New York Times and the Boston Globe and The Economist, as we saw here today, I'm very honored and privileged to tell the story of the English language creation of this discourse. 5 autumns, yes, are the years 2004 through 2008. And one of the most important things that I can say today is that he indeed wrote them himself in English. He don't speak or read Vietnamese. He couldn't do that. So he had to communicate with me in writing and in speaking in English in order to get his autobiography published. I was introduced to the poetry of Nguyen CHÍ THIệN early in the year 2004. I was part of an advisory group to the Oakland Museum of California, and they were putting on an exhibit that was called California and the Vietnam Era. Anybody remember that? Yes, all right. It was one that was glorifying the anti-war movement, and it had no inclusion of Vietnamese who were in California. And so this perspective was something that I wanted to continue in a seminar over at the community college where I was teaching U.S. history. And I invited Mr. Thien to come and speak about the textbooks and how biased they are in favor of Ho Chi Minh and having an incorrect history of many things concerning Vietnam. And then I brought him over to the Rodin Sculpture Garden at Stanford University. And so the famous picture that you see of him standing in front of the gates of hell by Rodin 2004. And it was on that day that he asked me to help him get his work into a wider world. And that wider world, of course, meant the English-speaking world. Now, he had 2 other people who were involved with him and in getting his work out to the wider world. One of them was Steve Denny, who had been an assistant to the late Douglas Pike and who was publishing the Indochina newsletter in the 1970s. And he was actually the first publisher of a translated one of the Hoa Dien Nuc poems. And then there was also Dan Duffy. Dan Duffy was at Yale with the Yale Forum, the Vietnam Forum. And he had this idea of a Vietnam literature project. And he asked Nguyen CHÍ THIệN to be his first author. And then he said, we ought to have an autobiography. And so you remember how Mr. Thien always had these yellow pads of paper that he would write on? So he put it right down there, and he wrote out his autobiography in English, because I couldn't type Vietnamese. And then when we got that down, Dan introduced the idea of having questions, and that we add interview. So we'd have a 3-way telephone conversation, and then after that I would transcribe what had been said and add that to the autobiography. And then the following year, he was invited by Manoa Magazine, which is published at the University of Hawaii, to publish his autobiography. And they wanted to know more about how he composed his poems in his mind. How did you do that without pencil and paper? And so he did that again by interview, and then I would type it down. And he said, now my friend Phung Hung, he always did his poems by counting on his fingers on the verses. But when I did it, I always put the verses in my mind at night when it was quiet, And then I would come out, and this was at the PHONG camp where he was between 1966 and 1977. And he said he would come and recite them to his friends, and they would critique them. And then he would go back the next night into his cell, and he would throw out all of the verses that he didn't want and put in the new ones. And it was just a fantastic method. And so then in the autumn of 2007 was published the Wallow Hanoi Hilton stories in English, which I had worked very closely with him and learned a great deal about his cadence, his style, and the way that he spoke, so that we could put this into the Wallow Hanoi Hilton stories. And then when that was done, we put out a bilingual edition of the story of HhelNG and the story that was called The Moon and the Waters of the Red River. So there's only the two stories in that book, but they're bilingual. You've got them in Vietnamese, you've got them in English. And when that was done, Tien said, well, our work is done now. And I was kind of disappointed about that because I had promised to continue his work. And I said, what if I joined Amnesty International and worked to free prisoners who are in Vietnam prisons now?